Of the series is Unleashed. And we've been talking about how it's always been God's desire for his people to be fully alive, to live unleashed. And you know what? Whether you're a Christian or not, or whether even you believe if there's a God or not, we can typically get in the same room and we can agree that as human beings, if you look at us, we're these amazing machines. Just like Aniakan was praying a minute ago. Now, if you look at the way that we're made and you look at the way that we're designed, we're these amazing beings. And I used to have a favorite machine. I'm looking for Phil Little. Where's Phil? Right here. There you are, Phil. I'm looking at Phil Little because my favorite machine used to be a 1998 Pontiac Firebird. It was sport metallic gold. And Phil and I talk about this vehicle all the time. We reminisce on it with cool memories. But you know what? As a machine, that machine was engineered to look cool. It was engineered to go fast. It was engineered to go far. And in the same way, if I look at the way that I'm made, if I look at the way that I'm engineered, I feel like there's a part of me. I want to go fast. I want to go far. I want to take corners quickly. I want to be inspired. I want to make a difference. I want to change lives. But in the same way, I feel like there's things about me that inhibit my ability to do that. And that's what this series is about. You see ordinary people revving up their engines and going fast and going far and fulfilling what God has always wanted them to do. And it's inspiring. In 2006, there was a mail carrier named Jill. And she lived in Livingston County, Michigan. And you know, Jill had seemingly an ordinary life and just went to work and just do what seemingly ordinary people do. And this went on for a long time. I think she was a mail carrier for about 10 years. And then she started to leave work early every day. And then her coworkers started to notice this. And then it started to happen more and more often. Actually, her boss noticed that she began to leave work every day, which isn't that unusual. But what is unusual is that Jill actually started to go to a rental facility, a storage unit facility every day. So she would leave work early, she would go to this this storage unit, and she used to go every day. And this got really, really weird, and people started to notice, but perhaps the most weird part was whenever Jill got behind on her payments to the rental storage facility, the owners of the rental facility went out and they unlocked the storage unit. And what Jill was doing, what the owners of the rental facility found, shocked the whole community. But I'm not going to tell you what they found just yet. Oh, you guys knew that was coming. You guys knew I wasn't going to give you the punchline. But what I will tell you is this. This is really cool because this is a story, or this is actually an excerpt from a letter. We don't know who wrote this letter, but we know that it's written to a man named Diogenes. And this was written right at the time of the first century Christians. And he encounters, whoever wrote this, describes his experience of encountering a community of Christians for the first time. And this is really cool. You don't find it in the Bible, but it's found outside of the Bible. But look at what he says, and this is really cool because it actually reads like it's some kind of a fantasy novel. Like, this is amazing. He says, "For the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country, nor language, nor the custom which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. They display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life, because they dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as if it was their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do all others. They beget children. They have a common table, but they don't have a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they themselves are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their very lives. They love all men, and yet they're persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet they abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor, they are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened unto life. Those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. But to sum it all up in one word, what the soul is to the body, that's what Christians are to the world. And it's an amazing passage. These people are living unleashed. And the Bible describes the same community of people. This comes from Acts chapter 4. It says that all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify about the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them, all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to anyone who he had need. You know, when I read this, imagine if you and I could live a life without being tethered to the financial pressures of this world. This talks about how they viewed their money, their personal possessions, and their wealth. But again, imagine if you didn't have to live, or if I didn't have to live by being tethered by the financial pressures. And imagine further that you don't have to be wealthy to live like this. And you don't have to be poor either. Because for some of us, it could be the things that we want to own. It could be the things actually that we want to finance sometimes. If you're like me, it might be how much money that you want to save. And these things can kind of form our identity. But I tell you, if they don't form your identity, then you probably know someone who it does. But if we can understand, in that letter we just saw and what the Bible described, I believe that if we can understand how these people viewed money, how they viewed their personal possessions, how they viewed their wealth, if we can make that our compass to be able to make decisions, we can be unleashed in an amazing way. Just like that letter that we saw, I believe that we can be to each other, we can be to our families, we can be to our children, we can be actually to anyone who's looking in from the outside. We can be to them what the soul is to the body. So, to understand this, I want us to buckle up, because by doing and being able to understand these things, there's so much freedom here. This is inspiring stuff. So to understand how they lived, for me, it's always helpful. If I want to change my behavior, then I need to change how I think. Because it's like pouring new wine into an old wineskin. If you're familiar with the Bible, that doesn't end well. So if we understand this and back up, really what the United States Constitution does for the United States, the Ten Commandments does for the nation of Israel. In the beginning, it lays out their core values. Here's what's important. Here's how you connect or relate to God. Here's how you relate to your family, your parents. Here's how you should relate to each other. And this little guy right down there, commandment number 10, thou shalt not covet. And that becomes a core value for what these people, how they want to live. And covet's not a word that we use very much anymore, but it basically means, hey, don't long for something that doesn't belong to you. And as simple as that is, if you're like me, I'm tempted to think when I think of someone who might be covetous or someone who desires to own something that doesn't necessarily belong to them, I'm tempted to think of someone who might have a nice car, someone who might wear really nice clothes, who maybe has the newest gadget. They might live in a big house. They might be wealthy. But what's interesting about this is that the original hearers of this message had none of those things. They were actually quite poor. They didn't have much. As a matter of fact, the only belongings that they had were those that they could carry as they were running away from Egypt. That's the original hearers of this message. And the point is that whether you have a lot or whether you have a little, as these people did, that when it comes to our money and our wealth and our possessions, freedom is not found in the accumulation of these things. Being free, being unleashed in this area of our lives when it comes to our money is about being content with what we already have. And this plays out in Israel's history, and there's a time in Israel's history whenever they're about to go into this new land. And God tells them, he says, look, you're going to see some cool things. You're going to see a lot of gold. You're going to see a lot of silver. But here's the important thing. He says, don't take it. Don't take it. Don't take it because the Bible says, the word that he uses is that it will ensnare you. And again, the bigger lesson here, above the gold and the silver, is that freedom is not going to be found in the accumulation of these things. It's going to be found in your ability to be content with what you already have. Because if you can't be content with what you already have, you're not going to be content with what you want to have. And if you're new to the Bible, you might be surprised to discover that Satan actually tries to tempt Jesus with this. And what's amazing to me is that, well, actually it's not amazing, but Jesus actually quotes a passage in response to this. Do you want to see the passage? Yeah. I do too. This is really cool. Look at this. This is a time when Israel is about to come into a new land where they're having all these wonderful things given to them. This is what Deuteronomy chapter 8 says. It says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, he causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you, and this is the part that probably sounds a little familiar, that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land. And then he's going to describe all these good things you're about to receive. A good land with streams and pools of water, with springs flowing in the valleys and hills, a land with wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills, everything you could want. And I pause right there because I love the symmetry and I love the balance that we're about to see. Because it comes with responsibility. He says that when you have eaten and when you're satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. And be careful that you don't forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and when you are satisfied, when you build fine houses and you settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and your gold increase and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart's going to become proud. And you'll forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of slavery. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something your fathers had never known, to humble and to test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, I've said this to myself, My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your forefathers, as it is today. And in other words, what God is saying to his people and to us is that we have to decide where our treasure is. We have to decide where our treasure is. It's like that movie from the Goonies, where they find that old rusty treasure map in the attic, and they look on the map and they know that wherever the X is, that's where the treasure is. If you follow the X, you'll know where the treasure is. Because the amazing thing about Israel is that God is saying, put your X on me. And this is really important because God is saying, I want you to stay with me. Put your X on doing what is right. Put your X on how you treat people. Because if you put it in the wrong place, if you put it on your possessions, this is not going to end well for you. And it doesn't end well for Israel. Israel becomes rich. They enjoy their most prosperous time in history under King Solomon. But it forgets its principles, and it becomes governed by its desires. And this happens gradually. This happens over time. I can relate to this. I spent a lot of time in my 20s and even in my early 30s. I was doing really well, having a lot of success, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I remember waking up, and I remember just feeling amiss. Because despite the successes that I had had, I just wanted a simpler life. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. But it got to the point to where I spent a lot of time just trying to manage people's perceptions of me. Because I was afraid of losing the possessions that I had just worked really hard for. And this is similar to Israel. And this is the time of the prophets, whenever the prophets are trying to tell the people, hey guys, your X is in the wrong place. We got to go back. We've got to remember what Deuteronomy 8 is all about. And it gets to the point to where one of the prophets actually says, everyone from the least to the greatest, from the priests to the prophets, everyone is greedy for gain. That's Jeremiah chapter 8 if you're taking notes. And things get the spiritual lights just get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until it's almost as if they just go out altogether. And then something cool happens. And again, if you're new to the Bible, if you're visiting, or if you're just not familiar, the Bible says that it's like, the image you get is like a light at the end of this tunnel. And it says that there is a voice of one who is calling in the desert. And people start getting excited again. And if you don't know, it's the voice of John the Baptist. He's actually the cousin of Jesus, if you don't know. And he starts talking about these same things. He starts talking about how to view their material possessions and their wealth. And he starts talking about where the X should be all along, that it should be on how we treat people. And becoming more like God and understanding who God is and being able to participate in being like him. And people start to come, and they come out in droves. They come out in crowds because what they're hearing, they know they're discontent. They know there's something wrong. And this guy comes out and he starts talking about where to put the X. Look at what they say. He says, what should we do then? These are the crowds. In John's response, he says, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none. Again, talking about possessions. And anyone who has food should do the same. Talking about how we should treat each other. This is where the X goes. And what's interesting as we go through this, and you'll see this even in John the Baptist's life, that as we practice the ability to become content with what we have and not in the accumulation of more things, is that people start to simplify. They're content with less. Even tax collectors came to be baptized. Teacher, they said, or they asked, what should we do? Don't collect any more than you're required to, he told them. Just be content. Then some soldiers asked him, and what should we do? He replied, don't extort money. Don't take advantage of people. And don't accuse people falsely. And there it is again. Be content with your pay. And this concept or this theme just continues to play out more and more. Because again, if you're not content with what you already have, you're not going to be content with what you want to have. And I'll tell you that when it comes to wealth is like owning bricks. Because there's nothing inherently evil about owning a bunch of bricks. Bricks can be used to build hospitals, build churches, to heal people. Or bricks can be used to destroy. They can be used to launch hatred through people's windows, to vandalize. But know this, that if you or I, if I take ownership of the bricks, that there's a weight of responsibility. And if you remember our fellow from King Solomon, again, he was one of the most richest people, and you can read all about him. And actually, his life is a case study in this, in and of itself. But this is just a small passage from Ecclesiastes. He says that whoever loves money is never going to have money enough. And whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. But the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. William Henry Vanderbilt was regarded as one of the richest men at the end of the 18th century. And I love the way he says it. He says that the care of $200 million is enough to kill anyone. There's just no pleasure in it. And this reminds me of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus, and I believe that he feels leashed in this way as well. And he asks Jesus, he's like, what do I need to do? And Jesus can see. He can see that this guy has kind of put himself in prison by tethering himself to all these wealth and all these material possessions. And he challenges him. And he says, hey, you know what you need to do? You need to just get rid of it. Sell it and then come follow me. And that's what that guy needed to hear, because it's a sad case. But what ends up happening is that he actually ends up being walking away, but he's very sad because he knew that he was tethered to it. And I think this is really the same spirit of what's going on here. Here's a rags to riches story. I was going to comment on that, but I don't need to. But it's true. I love the way Henry Ford says it. He says that I was happier when I was doing a mechanic's job. Again, there's a weight, there's a responsibility that comes with taking ownership of this wealth, of these possessions, of these bricks, if you will. So you might ask yourself, and I ask myself, well, if I have wealth or if I have material possessions, and by the way, I would put myself in this category, then what do I do? How should I view my money, my possessions, so that I don't end up feeling like this? How do I get rid of this tether that I feel? I'm happy you asked, because the answer is actually already in Acts chapter 4. And you might have missed it, but we'll go there again. It says that all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. In other words, the first century Christians didn't take ownership of their wealth. And what do I mean by that? There's a really helpful illustration, and I think it'll benefit. I'll go ahead and say, let's just say that let's say that actually it won't be me, it'll be my wife, who goes on Amazon to order the pink baby romper with flowers on it. And my wife, she'll go on to Amazon, and a few days pass by, and it doesn't show up at our house. And then, well, that's a little unusual. But then we call, or my wife calls, and Amazon says, well, hey, we shipped it. We don't have it. It's not here. So then we have to go back, and we do a little more work, and then we call FedEx, and FedEx discovers, well, hey, the package was never delivered because it was in the delivery driver's house. The delivery driver kept the package. And that sounds absurd. But to go back to our original story when I was telling you about Jill, the mail carrier, whenever they came in and they unlocked the rental facility, they found over 2,000 pounds of mail that had been stored away and was never delivered to people. And people later, she confessed that she would get magazine subscriptions, and instead of delivering them, she just wanted to read magazines. And then she would get boxes, and she knew the boxes contained DVDs. And she would just keep them. And over time, this accumulated. But here's my point, is that whether you're a FedEx driver or whether you're just that story, the people who deliver the packages, they never take ownership of the packages. I'll say it again, because even if you're assigned and if they handle the boxes, they never take ownership of them. And this is how the first century Christians viewed their possessions. And that's incredibly liberating for me. That's an entirely different way to view your possessions, your wealth, and your money. And what does this look like for me? I'll tell you, if I make it practical, what does this look like for me? What does it mean to be unleashed in this way? And for me, and this may apply for you as well, instead of instead of having an indulgent vacation, consider going to a lesser known or lesser part of the world. And even if you're watching online, wherever you may be, you don't have to travel far. It could actually be in this city. It could be in Jacksonville or wherever you're watching. But do that with the intent of having an awareness of other people's needs so that you can be content with what you already have. That's a very powerful thing. And I love coming back. Coming back from work and people ask me, where did you go? And I tell them, I went to Malpasio, Nicaragua. And that's always interesting because, people, that always precipitates questions like, why did you go there? Or why? I can't even find that on a map. But that's a great opportunity to share about why you go and what you do when we're there. Another thing too, when I reflect on this, and I'm just going to talk about myself. Maybe you can look over my shoulder, maybe you'll try the shoe on and maybe it might fit. But I have this temptation in myself to say, I want to make more money so that I can give more money. And I'll tell you, and again, I'm talking about myself, but I'll tell you, when I strip that down and I really look at it, the bigger desire is that I want to make more money so that I can keep more money. But that's actually the opposite of being content. And for me, again, the practice that I see whenever the disciples practice this, whether it's John the Baptist, when he talks about if you have 2 shirts, then you should share one. If you have more food than you need, you should share one. You see them starting to simplify and having less and less, not more and more. And it's also the same thing when you see the disciples. Instead of taking their land and buying more land so that they can have more land, they actually sell the land that they currently have, and they begin to have more contentment with less and less. And that might apply to you. It applies to me. But I'll tell you, I'll go ahead and dismiss the ushers if we can go ahead and finish. But I'll tell you that one of my favorite things about being a Christian, being unleashed in this area of our lives, is that whenever the first century church, whenever they lived like this, the coolest things started to happen. That they weren't bound anymore by social class. They weren't bound anymore by the economic barriers. the racial barriers, all these walls, the Bible says these dividing walls of hostility, they were removed. And if you remember in the first quote, we said that they had a common table. And that's what this time is for communion, is that we all get to come together and sit at the same table, regardless of our economic background, regardless of our social class, regardless of where we've come from, is that there are people all over the world. And there are people even in this congregation that I don't think I would typically have a relationship with. But because of God and because he set us free from these kind of rules, we're not bound anymore by the rules that can leash us. And that's an exciting thing. So can we go ahead and just come forward with the communion? And again, if you're just visiting, we don't want you to feel weird. You can totally, you can pass the plate if you choose to, but you're certainly welcome to join us at this table. But let's give thanks for the freedom that we have to be unleashed from our material possessions and to be able to just consider ourselves as delivery drivers instead. God, thank you so much for setting us free and teaching us, God, where to put the X, where our treasure is. Because, God, we know where our treasure is, there are our hearts going to be also. And I pray that as we take this bread and this juice, God, we connect with the things that are most important. God, that we participate in becoming like you. That we learn how to forgive, God, that we are fully unleashed. God, that we're able to forgive and make a difference and make an impact. And God, just enjoy the freedoms that we have in our lives. God, so that we can be to each other, to the world, God, what the soul is to the body. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name I give thanks. Amen.